So my hope today is that we can spend some time mapping the field of young adults media use, really from a top-down broad perspective to a narrow, broad being what do they do with media in general, and more narrow, understanding a little bit more about their news consumption. I also hope that we'll build some foundational knowledge for teaching news and media literacy, what I like to think of as the main concepts that you could hope to bring into your classroom in whatever way is best suited for you and your students. And then during our interactive session, I'm hoping that we will get to explore some different structures, different strategies and approaches for engaging students, especially some tough decision-making, other ways that we can navigate this content in a world that is a little bit polarized right now for teaching media and teaching news literacy. So I'd like to start by just laying down the foundation of where I'm coming from when I talk about news literacy. So there are lots of definitions for news literacy, and we could look at how those are useful in different contexts, but my favorite definition comes from the Robert McCormick Foundation, and it's an approach about what it means to be news literate. And their approach is that to be news literate is about building knowledge, thinking critically, acting civilly, and participating in the democratic process. So this is an approach and this is a definition that resonates with my work. There are certainly other ways to sort of couch the idea of news literacy. What I love about this is the emphasis on acting civilly. I think it is an essential component to our news literacy education. It's also a perfect match for news literacy education when we think about what we do in the classroom, so social emotional learning and opportunities to help our students navigate the world as people. I think acting civilly is a really essential component. So for me, this is a definition that really brings together all the reasons why I love news literacy and the ways in which I hope to bring it to my students. So more specifically, we can think about news literacy as the process where students learn to discern fact from fiction, where they assess material and personal bias, where they evaluate the quality of their news, where they actively engage with news media. And so these are more specific, you can see tied to taxonomy, ways to scaffold learning. And I love this approach. It's very simple. There are other devices that we can use to think about news and media literacy. We can think about description, analysis, interpretation, evaluation, engagement, sort of the 5-step process. All of those are useful, right? What I like to remind teachers, I work with a lot of teachers who are nervous about news and media literacy, and they might feel underprepared. You are more prepared than you think you are because you're educators, you're experts at what you do, you're experts in the classroom, and you already know how to do these skills and to deal with these different levels of learning across other material. So it's really just honing the ways that we can apply that specifically to news and journalism. I think there's a lot of conversation also about the new literacies. I might put that in quotes because I don't think they're actually that new anymore, but I think it is important to recognize news literacy's place among a wider field. And we can talk about media literacy, we can talk about data literacy, digital literacy, information literacy. One of my students even mentioned the phrase research literacy the other day as being separate from information literacy, which I thought was fascinating. But thinking about news literacy and placing it among these other skills is useful for us as educators to really think about what is right for our classroom. So you might think about these skills and these literacies as essential or a perfect match for the text standards for your classroom. And you might realize I want to come at this specifically from a digital literacy side, dealing with news. That is still news literacy. So I think it's useful to look at all of these ways that we are teaching new 21st century skills. And sometimes as teachers, we get bogged down in the nuance of what those can look like. But I think all of these are just really wrapped up in news literacy and useful for us to think of together. You're here. I don't think I have to sell you on why it's important to teach it. However, I do think that coming from different communities, I have lived in very diverse communities, politically, culturally, in terms of value judgments. And sometimes it's important to be able to communicate why we should teach this when there are a lot of negative perceptions about the media and news. Some of those are warranted, and we'll talk about that. But I think these reasons are especially important for our students. I think when we talk about college and career readiness, those are 21st century skills and what our students will take with them when they go off to the workforce, to higher education. News literacy will be at the core of that. And the skills and critical inquiry processes they practice will be essential. Our world is mediated. Very few of us get information directly from the source ever. And so as our world is increasingly mediated, we want to learn the processes for dealing with that. And then I also think civic participation is a worthwhile outcome of news literacy education. So we often think of civics as really duty bound, right? We teach civics so that people will go vote or do something with it. I think what news literacy encourages us to remember is that information and knowledge is also a way of being civically active. And I really love that about the field. So to give us some sort of capacity here to understand what mediation looks like in the world we live in today, this is a wonderful graphic that I share with my students about what happens on the internet in 1 second. And so you can see that, for example, in 1 second, 9,000 different tweets might appear. And since I've opened this web page, almost 300,000 new tweets are appearing. And it's a very interesting, I'm going to put the link right here in the chat for all of you. This is a very interesting way for students to realize just how massive the internet and digital media is and how saturated we are with that information. So I could just keep scrolling, I won't, but you could see, for example, Instagram, Google, emails, all of these things. And it's a fascinating way for us to really grasp the scope of what we're dealing with. So when we think about mediation and why we would teach this and some of the concepts that we want to bring to our students, this is a model that comes from the News Literacy Project in collaboration with Stony Brook University's News Literacy Center. And these are some main concepts of news literacy that underpin how we teach it in our classroom. So they are assumptions that form the foundation of our work. I think we agree for the most part, hopefully, that these are wonderful assumptions. Informed citizens are essential to good government. Citizens have to take an active role in becoming well-informed and in sharing accurate information. I sometimes spend an entire day with my students on simply dissecting what more active role looks like and what that can be for them. We will actually see what that looks like for students when we look at some of the data here in a minute. And then this is really essential. You know, when we got your wonderful feedback about what you're hoping to learn from this series, sort of a pre-news assessment, and the idea about bias and assumptions and challenging personal views is a perennial problem with news literacy. And one of the ways that I deal with that as an educator is just reminding myself that this problem existed or this challenge existed before news because we're human. And so human nature drives a lot of these issues. And it's nice to think of it as just how do we become better humans a little bit versus it's all about journalism or it's all about the news. And then being open-minded is another aspect about that. So how do we open our minds to new facts and new ideas? So these are assumptions I like to share with my students to really just frame out why we're talking about this, ways that we will approach information and approach our learning. So speaking of that learning, some learning outcomes, and there are others that I would love to share with you. I pulled some of my favorite learning outcomes that I use either in a specific news literacy class, like a standalone course, or that I've incorporated in my English class or other related like journalism classes at different levels. So things like students will distinguish information from opinion, agenda, and spin. Identifying biased information sources, always something to work with. Seeking information that is contextual, information that is thorough. This is not always the same as what students think of as truth, seeking truth, because truth can evolve over time. So we talk about some of that nuance. I always like to talk about and bring in the idea of like economics and technology and the 24-hour news cycle. So this would be a learning outcome. For example, if you teach an economics class, maybe you teach more of a production video media class, thinking about that would be a relevant learning outcome for a news literacy unit or course. And then helping students understand the greater democratic and ethical imperatives for producing and consuming information is an outcome that we want to move them to, I think, all the time. This is one that we see through many assignments and not necessarily like in a discrete skill. It's a disposition that we hope they'll take with them for a really long time. And then a learning outcome or objective that I always bring into any news literacy curriculum is engagement. So completing the literacy cycle from being aware and understanding to actually doing something with that information. Crafting meaningful responses or interactions with the media is really important. It's also where students get to be creative and kind of have fun with it, and they tend to really enjoy the way that that completes their learning cycle. And then this is just another point that I wanted to share because it informs, I think, for you a little bit more about where I'm coming from. I teach news literacy from the perspective for my students that I want them to demand better. So if news and journalism isn't serving them or serving their communities in the way that it is supposed to, they should become part of the solution. And so helping them to understand that there's empowerment in that role is really important for me as an educator. So some critical questions that we can ask, and this is going to lead us into understanding the field a little bit, kind of looking at some of the data, would be, how are students even engaging with media and news? I think as teachers, we have our own assumptions on what that looks like. And I'm here to tell you, you're probably not wrong on a lot of them, but there's useful information we can get from some of that data. And we can kind of turn it into that beautiful teaching moment. What do students think news is? What do they think journalism is or supposed to be? And then where do they encounter news media? So how are they engaging? Where are they engaging? And like, what are their perceptions? So when we map the field of adolescent news consumption and we look at some current research, what I did, there's so much out there, but I brought sort of broad media related research down to some narrow data on how students get their news. So we'll start with a sort of broad perspective about teens using their cell phones. I know as a teacher, the number of times that I tell them to put their phones away, it would buy me a country, right? And a castle. And I have developed certain attitudes about that I actually have to sort of check at the door. Because when I look at the research and how teens report what they're doing on their phones, it's actually quite positive. So, for sure, we get students who are just passing time. They're just trying to kill time on their phone. But if we look at this data, we can see, 80% of students between often and sometimes say they're learning new things. And so this is an important realization that teacher me fights with like news researcher me, because I see this and I want to embrace their habits, but I'm also still sort of focused on old habits. Read a newspaper, kids, right? So I think that this is a good way for us to just remember, there's a lot of things they're doing with their phones, and from their perspective, a lot of it is more positive than what we might conceptualize. And then of course we know that sometimes they're avoiding interacting with people, but this data point for me really stands out. Oh, that was Pew Research, sorry. Let me go here. These will all be hyperlinked, as you can see when you get the slides, so you can go straight to the original sources. So another data point from Pew Research that I thought was really interesting was how teens report what they experience online. And this chart is not that user friendly, so I'm going to point out a couple things. So this essentially looks at teen positive experiences, negative experiences, correlated with how much time they are online. And so we see, for example, that there are definitely some positive feelings. Students who are online almost constantly will experience positive feelings of being connected to what's going on. Likewise, we can also see, if we go down to the negative feelings, we will see that students who, or teens who are online often, 20% of them who are online almost constantly are going to experience negative feelings, feelings of pressure to post content that makes them look good to others. So when we think about the teenage experience online, it's also easy to just assume it's pretty similar to our experience online, and that may not actually be true. It may be more dichotomous for teens than we realize. Another point from the broad perspective about media, technology, and teenagers that I think is really important to remember is the extent to which teenagers might experience cyberbullying or negative content. And you might be wondering sort of what that has to do with news media, and I'll connect the dots here in just a second. But if we look at this, we see, 59% of students have experienced some kind of cyberbullying online or on their cell phone. This is the reality of the world in which they live. And we can see everything from offensive name calling to spreading rumors to explicit images. And I think it's really important to remember that their phones, which are a gateway to their life, can hold just this wide range of experience, from really empowering to really defeating, and in fact, quite harmful. So what does this data mean for us? In other words, why might we think of this in terms of news literacy and teaching about news media? So that dichotomous experience, teens experience both negative and positive impacts from the media. I would say most of the teachers sort of in my generation who went through, education programs at the same time I did, we existed in a space where the research was mostly concerned with negative impacts. And we understood media to be a force to be mitigated, mediated, and sort of, we came at it from like this deficit perspective. And I think it's really important as educators to set that aside if you also were sort of brought up with that mindset as a teacher. So avoiding a negative or a cynical entry point into teaching news literacy, sort of avoiding that deficit thinking, is really important. It also is a good reminder for us to acknowledge what's meaningful to them. So we need to just honor the fact that they are where they are and they do what they do with their media, and find ways to connect to that versus trying to totally shift habits. So it brings us to a renewed focus on critical literacy and informed citizenry. Their media is not going to look like our media, so we want to meet them where they are. So looking more specifically at what that is, Common Sense, I believe this is 2019 when they released this information, did a large study of teens and news, and they looked at topics, where they're getting news, how often they're getting news, and what that looked like for teens. And I'll just highlight a few points for us. So 29% said, every day I'm getting news from social media sites like Twitter or Facebook. We know that's just the platform. So they're getting news via some content producer through the platform. And those distinctions are important. And they come into play with the type of news we get and our experience with that. YouTube, a few times a week, they get news from YouTube. I'm still baffled by this. I'm not going to lie. But my students tell me it is indeed true. And they point me to their favorite, news personalities. Maybe we can use that for YouTube. And it very much is almost like a show, like a late night show for them. 26%, a few times a week, are still getting news through legacy publications, right? The ones that we're probably familiar with. So print or online. I think that's awesome. That gives me a lot of, for me, a lot of flexibility in how I hope to help them shape their media habits. And then less than once a week, students get their news from television. So they're not really getting it from television, which I think is also a big change from perhaps their teachers. So we think because students are on their phone, they're getting news from digital aggregators, kind of. So, a quarter of them are getting it from there a few times a week. So we might think of new tools as being really helpful when in reality, they're still going to social media and some of those platforms that have been around for a while. So if we turn to news organizations in print or online, and we break that down even further, I was happy that 25% said they got it once, a few times a week, but 22% say never. So for me as an educator, that is a great reminder that I have to expand my own consumption in order to understand and be familiar with what they're getting as well. And this to me, I know that it is true, but when I see this stat, it still just hits me in my tracks because, when students talk about major news events and what gives them the best understanding, they are visual creatures. Like 64%, would rather see it or see a video. And I think that's also very different from probably the habits of teachers who are very interested in the words and the construction and the deep dive into the text. So for us, this data looks like reminding ourselves that our teen habits they're not ours, nor will we be. So our goal as news literacy educators is not to build news consumption habits that we feel are appropriate and that mimic what we do or what has been common in the world. And I think sometimes we forget that. My student journalists would remind me all the time when I wanted them to do more hard-hitting news that they're just high schoolers, so they would do it every now and then, but their habits are different. Social media emphasis is vital. We'll look at ways to bring that into some of these concepts. And then visual literacy. So we talked about those new literacies or concomitant literacies and how they can impact our students. If we can bring the visual to this discussion as much as possible, my sense is engagement will go up with these concepts. So that for me is a nice reminder as an educator. So let's talk about, before we transition to our Q&A section here, the concepts that you might want to think about teaching in your classroom. These are not directives. These are just suggestions. So my goal would be that you look at these and absolutely use what fits best for your classroom, for the curriculum you have, for the learning objectives you'd like to focus on. I always divide when I think about news literacy and I think about what I want to talk about or how I want to guide my curriculum. I think about two different concept sets. I think about media, I think about the brain. So when I think about media, I think about what do I need to teach students about journalism, misinformation, all of these things. And I hear you're going to get a wonderful talk also on fake news, which is a great entry point right now. Then I think about what do they need to understand about how their brain operates. Part of teaching media literacy and news literacy, which has been a tremendous learning curve for me, is a little bit of psychology, some cognitive learning theories, just a lot more nuance about the brain than I ever expected it to be. When I first started this, I thought it's just journalism. Teach them journalism, and then they will seek good journalism. And it just didn't turn out to be that simple for me. So I've highlighted some of these terms to just give you a sense of how you might sort of construct what you want out of your learning experience in your classroom and for your students. Journalism, I think, is probably the one must on that list. News literacy, teaching news literacy is a normative practice, right? It is a normative engagement in that we need to have a baseline to compare it to. We need students to understand what good journalism is supposed to look like, why it looks that way, so that when we see all the other things, we can better identify it. So journalism as the foundation, so that when we see biased news, partisan news, propaganda, fake news, misinformation, sensationalism. As we start to tease out the nuance in news messages or media messages, we've got that baseline of what journalism is supposed to be. So these are terms, I might deal with all of them in a semester, or depending on my class, or if it's even just 1 week, I might pick something that's most relevant to what's going on in the world. So if we look at our brain terms, these are ways that I want my students to understand their brain is working with them or against them when they come to the media. And sometimes we don't even know. So I want them to understand selective exposure and confirmation bias and hostile media. I want them to understand motivated reasoning. So when people talk about conspiracy theories, they have a frame of reference for understanding, hey, like if somebody believes a conspiracy theory, they're not stupid. It's not because they're an idiot. It's because they're using motivated reasoning. They are engaging emotional sides of their brain in preference over logic, but it doesn't make them stupid. So that would be, for me, a really important conversation in the class to help them understand what brains are doing, what people are doing when they engage in the news. And as I mentioned, hopefully you can look at these and see, this would fit in my classroom and this isn't right for it, because news literacy is such a vast field that there's no wrong way or I should say that nothing is too small to teach, right? You can teach a little or a lot and still be doing right by your students when we're making that effort to engage.